Right, so I'm gonna get us started so that Les has his full hour. What do you say about Les? Les Harris and I, we started at Utah Foster Care the same month, September of 1999. So in the last century. So we've been around for 2 centuries at Utah Foster Care. And he was the trainer out in Eastern, I was a trainer in Salt Lake. And so we've had just years and years of, I hope Les feels the same way, just wonderful professional association and friendship. And he was a trainer with us for, what do you say, about 20, what do you say, Les, about 22 years, 22, 23
years, yeah.
Yeah. And he still is, obviously he's training today, he still is. But he also, the last year and a half or so, he's now heading up the clinical support program through Utah Foster Care. So some of you may have had some interaction with Les in that. One thing Les said yesterday is just a reminder to everybody that we do have this. There are folks in every region that kind of head up that. So as you need, it really was started with the idea that when children are reunified, go to kin, go back to their parents, that grief, we weren't helping folks handle that as well as we could. And that's kind of the genesis of that, but it's also evolved into maybe helping folks handle other difficulties that can come with foster care too. So Les is heading up that program. So he's a fabulous trainer, but also an amazing clinician and human being. So I'm just going to go ahead and give him the floor. Thank you, Les.
Oh, thank you. Boy, it's remarkable when you talk about us being around for so long. That one to stay with something so long, it just is a testament to I think the passion we all share for this work. I really believe that, and I talked about that yesterday. And by the way, I apologize to all of you who get a double dose of me. I did present at as Liz pointed out, I did present at the facilitator retreat. So here we are again, many of the same foster parents and some caseworkers or RFCs and others that may have heard from me yesterday. So I hope that's okay. But one of the things that in thinking about how long I've been doing this and some of the experiences that I've had, certainly the last almost 25 years, we have been working with foster parents and training them and getting them ready and helping them feel supported in the process. And sometimes I forget, well, the first 10 years of my career, I was a caseworker and I worked for DCFS, and I had a lot of experiences in helping with the foster care process and placement of children and working with birth parents and so on and on it goes. And over the course of my career, I've learned a bunch of stuff. But one of the things that jumps out is we've evolved in our understanding of the deep and lasting connections that children maintain, regardless of the trauma, with their birth parents. And as you've heard from the presenters earlier, there's plenty of research, and I'm not going to regurgitate any of that research. But there's plenty of research that tells us that kids that have frequent visits and that certainly have the opportunity to maintain those connections with their families are going to be better off long term than those who don't have those opportunities. So first of all, you've talked about how to make those better. We've talked about why they're important. But we also recognize that they don't always go as planned. And that's part of the frustration, because one of the things we encounter, all of you have certainly been there, is birth parents who are not always as cooperative, or perhaps they're aggressive, perhaps they're even non-participatory in some circumstances. And so how do we rectify those circumstances to improve the overall outcomes for what we do? And how do we work with birth parents who are resistant? So, and again, I sometimes think that all of us are anticipating that there's going to be some kind of a magic bullet here, that somehow we have to reinvent the wheel and think of new ways to encounter our birth parents out there. And the truth is, it does come back to relationships and connections. And for all of us, as I prepared to have this conversation today, I thought about why are we complicating this more than we need to? I think we have to go back to some very important foundational principles of relationship building and maintenance. And just for me, it reminded me as well that sometimes I find myself very defensive when I'm challenged. Sometimes I find myself resistant to the person I'm working with simply because of disagreements and so forth. And and it occurred to me that that's probably not a great place to work with somebody from. And I said, well, if we're going to address how we work with birth families effectively, we've got to go back to our foundations of understanding what relationships are and how we're going to respond to them in ways that are going to be useful. And I go back to those first probably 3 months of casework practice when I was with DCFS. And I don't know, I don't want to sound arrogant, but I've always thought of myself as a relatively nice guy who has the ability to relate well with people. I've always believed that about myself. And as many of you know, I love to chat. I can tell stories. I'm very sociable. And so I've always somewhat seen myself in that light. And I can't ever forget that first time I went to visit a birth parent as a caseworker. I'll never forget knocking on the door, and immediately upon recognition that I was from DCFS, the person attacked me. They called me names. I heard some foul language. I was threatened. And and I remember feeling the need to somehow defend myself because that's not really who I am. The person on the other inside the doorway was not representing who I am. So I felt this need to defend myself. And in the end, what I discovered is I walked away angry. The person, the birth parent, was clearly not happy, and I didn't feel good. And that happened a few times. When I do these visits, I'm thinking, why am I being attacked? I'm not this person. And so I had to stop and think, what am I doing wrong? And I don't know, I'm not smarter than the average person out there. I just believe I had to reevaluate my approach to what I was doing. And the first thing that occurred to me, and that, so long ago, was when I go to the door, who do I want to be? I want to be less. And less is this kind of person. And so I'd knock on the door, and using this idea that regardless of what's happening on the other side of this conversation, I wanted to stay me. I wanted to be less. And that started to guide and direct how I responded, even in the most aggressive circumstances. So I remember the shift, and I knocked on a door yet again, another experience where potentially I felt I was going to be attacked. And sure enough, the person, and it was I'll call her Mrs. Smith, she looked at me and began to, how dare you take my kids? You're only trying to place them for adoption. I'm never going to get them back. All the things we classically hear from so many of our families. And I simply looked at her and I said, Mrs. Smith, I can't imagine what it's like to have a total stranger come to your house to have to talk to you about losing your children, something to that effect. And she goes, yeah, I'm so angry. And she's used some foul language in the process. I'm so angry and I'm so upset. I said, yeah, I can see that you're angry. Tell me what's so hard. What's been the hardest part of this for you so far? And so as I changed my approach, within just a few minutes, I saw her starting to now respond to me differently in a way that I felt was going to become more useful. And in the end, I was able to ask a very important question that I think was the turning point in how I was able to work with this particular family. And uh, I asked her, so why do you think it is that DCFS got involved in your family in the first place? And she kind of bowed her head and she started to tear up a little bit. And she told me, I mean, here I am, DCFS, allegedly with the power to really alter the outcome of her life and her children's lives. She looked at me and said, well, he started back on meth. And I said, wow, that's a tough one. That's a tough addiction, isn't it? And maybe there's some things I can do to help. And so from that moment, she invites me in the door. We're sitting down and we're doing some planning on what we should do differently in order to help her get through the struggles that she's having, as well as focus on what that means to have her children return to her. And I'll never forget that just that simple shift away from resistance and to empathy was perhaps the one thing that not only helped me in that circumstances, that then began to reinforce and guide my career throughout, where I had to step back and try, as hard as it is sometimes, to look at what's happening in their world through their eyes. And I remember one of the things that helped me early was I was a young father, 2 children. I think I had a 2-year-old and a newborn, a relatively newborn son. And I thought to myself, even back then, man, what would it be like for me, for somebody to come into my life and for me to have my children taken or removed from my home in some way? And I could never wrap my head around that thought. I could not even see that as a possibility. I only knew that because of how I loved my children, that had to be devastating. And then I began to apply that to my birth parents that I worked with. How devastating it was for them to have to go through this experience. So that's kind of laying the groundwork for our discussion today. And when I say discussion, I really do prefer the opportunity to have a conversation. As opposed, I know we're going to ask questions and put them in the chat, and that's great. Except I'm not great at technology, so if I go on for 10 minutes and then I take a pause and ask for questions, that's my preferred method to address you, simply because it's more interactive for me and that's what I prefer. But at the same time, maybe I'm not always going to notice the chat as efficiently as others. So I'm hoping we can address all of your comments as we go on. So having said that, I'm going to talk about, or at least ask you the question, and I want you to reflect on this for just a moment. But I know there's caseworkers and there's foster parents out there. We regularly face challenges to engage families and extended family members. So what are these challenges for you? I can share with you my experiences. I can talk to you a lot about how I've been able to mitigate some of the problems that we sometimes encounter. But we have a vast resource of knowledge beyond my experience out there. If we have caseworkers and administrators and others who have worked many years in this field and have had experiences, we need to know what those are and how you've been able to work effectively with our families. So having said that, I want to give you a minute to reflect. I want to first of all talk about the basis of why it's so difficult to work with our families at in some circumstances, and then some of the things we can do to mitigate that. So having said that, first of all, let's talk about the primary emotion that is occurring when we first encounter birth parents. Now, I'm not saying this is universal. I'm not saying that this is everybody's experience, but it is, for me, has been the vast majority of my families, initially at least, are aggressive and angry and insulting, and the list goes on. And so, first of all, we have to assess, is this anger justified? Well, based on my understanding of relationships between parents and children, I would say yes. Mainly, the question becomes, would you be angry too? And I think the answer has to be yes, that all of us would recognize that somehow an intervention into our world that felt intrusive and that we felt powerless to do anything about would result in a response of anger. In other words, we're going to be protective of our children. We will fight to the death, I would assume, to protect them. And so when that is threatened, we respond often with anger. And that's the underlying emotion here. So is that anger justified? I'm going to say yes, it is. And just like the parent I described a minute ago, I would agree that their anger was clearly evident, but because of the way I was able to validate that emotion and help them understand the source of their own emotion, that helped me then regain at least a little bit of trust, I'm assuming, with that parent. So is the anger justified? Yes, I'm going to say yes. Are there disagreements with that? Do you believe, and I mean, maybe it's an absurd question, but do you believe that most of our parents simply are justified in how they respond to the loss of their children? Okay, see that there's probably people, there's probably people, I can't even say that. I'm mixing probably and people at the same time. So there is probably people who are putting things in the chat, and for some reason I can't see it. So if you have a comment, please feel free to unmute yourselves and make that comment. Okay, so if we know that anger,
So
oh
Les,
yes, yeah,
do you want me to read? There's two that I see. One from Jessica Wilding. How about the challenge of holidays and visits? And then Erilyn asks or states, for me, it's fear of retribution from DCFS if things don't go well with the birth family, the accusations that the foster family receives because the first family is lashing out. And several people say they do feel that the parents are justified in being angry.
yeah, okay. Oh, hey, if I escape from my presentation, I can actually scroll through the chat. I just discovered that as you were talking, so thank you. So yeah, and it's interesting that the description from one participant is, the fear of retribution and fear, but of so many things that are happening that are unknown for the birth parent. And I would agree that fear is the essentially the primary emotion driving that anger. I mean, one of the most significant outcomes of fear is using anger and aggression to somehow regain a feeling of control. So ultimately, yes, I think that's probably true. But we see the anger as displayed in a way that becomes aggressive verbally and hopefully not physically, although I do know circumstances where there have been foster parents, caseworkers, and others, and not in a serious way, but have had small physical altercations as a result of that. So we have to pay attention to that, what's driving that. And as we think about then, what are some of the challenges, we recognize that they're driven usually by, in a sense, a justified emotional response to what's happening in their world. And so that's where I have to make a decision as the person intervening. Who do I want to be? Now, I don't know everyone out there. I know enough of you to say most of you are nice people. Most of you that I know are professional, and most of you have skills and abilities that are polished, and you practice your work very well. And so I just have to look at that and say, you are all able to look at yourself in the mirror and say, when I'm caseworker less, who do I want to be? Who am I? And am I going to give the power to somebody else to make that go away? I always want to maintain that idea that I don't want to change who I am in response to somebody else's anger, fear, aggression, whatever the case may be. And I'll never forget one time, and this was a different scenario. I'm driving down the road and my wife happened to be with me, and I received a phone call. And as soon as is this hello, is this Les? I said, yes. And immediately, I mean, foul language, just a personal attack like I've never seen or rarely seen. And I'm holding the phone away from my face because it was so intrusive, this and the language. And so I held the phone away from my ear, and the person ranted, and finally just stopped and said, are you even listening to me? Because I wasn't responding to that in any sort of way. And I simply said, and I'm trying to model exactly the voice that I used in that circumstance. I said, I'm sorry, Johnny, I can't speak with you when you're swearing at me like that. And he's, oh, you know what, you're right, I'm just so, and he used a different word for anger, but he said, I'm so this, and I said, yeah, you are angry. And so tell me what's happening. Tell me your thoughts. What's happening right now? And then we were able to have a conversation. And later in the conversation, he ratcheted back up a bit. And I had to remind him, remember, Johnny, when you start swearing, it's hard to have a conversation. And we were able to end the call relatively on a good terms. And as soon as the call was over, my wife looked at me, and I'll never forget, she asked me this question: why would you let somebody treat you that way? And based on what I've already described, I said, why would I let somebody else determine who I want to be? I was going to be me. And I'm not going to be the guy that's trying to defend myself and meet his foul language with my own. I'm not going to be that person. I am going to be the one who says, I am here to help you. How can I do that? And I don't have to respond, and I didn't, to the verbal attacks. And I think sometimes we personalize that, don't we? It's hard not to. When you're called names, and I've been called my fair share of names over the years, but when somebody's attacking you personally, that is not easy to take. Would you all agree? I'm just going to assume you're all saying yes in the chat. I'm going to scroll down. So yeah, confusing. Yes, there it is. So my point is, if just because I'm talking about this in the way I am, doesn't mean it's easy. There are times, and I'm not going to suggest to anyone that I haven't messed this up. I haven't started to get caught in that trap where I suddenly have to justify, I have to attack back, I have to explain, I have to talk about and meet their aggression with my own. That's unfortunate. But for me, and I realize in those moments, it doesn't work out. So I have to remember that concept. Who am I? Who do I want to be in this relationship? So that's, for me, at least been a really good guiding force in a lot of my practice. Of course, is because we know that people can be aggressive and insulting and do all the other things that we have grown familiar with over the years. the first thing I remind people, and now Liz had mentioned, I've been training, I've been in the training department or the education department for 22 years. I was trained who knows how many foster families over those years. And those of you who know me will know that one of them, when we got to the best part of what I thought was the education piece, was how do I help children manage their difficult emotions and behaviors? One of my primary principles was, as a parent, to stay calm. And people would laugh, oh yeah, stay calm, that's easy. And I would never imply it's easy to do. All I would suggest to is that's the secret to helping regulate a dysregulated child. So as I begin to use those same principles from what I learned about my experiences with birth families and other aggressive individuals, applying that in a parenting scenario or in relationships in general, became key or critical to the successes I felt like I had over the years. And one of the hard things I think for me has been that foster parents, or excuse me, birth parents, present in a certain way initially. Their lives are in chaos. They're addicted to substances. They have a myriad of mental health issues potentially, and a number of other things that have gone on, including their own trauma histories. And so I know all of those things, and this recognition, and I think we heard it yesterday in our symposium, or excuse me, in the facilitator retreat, when the athletes to addict during that presentation, where the statistics on recovery, say from addiction, isn't great. In other words, who's going to make it? We plug you into all of these services. We try to help you as much as we can, but how do we know if you're going to make it or not? And so the theory behind my practice was always, I don't know who's going to be successful. I don't know which family, which parent is going to recover. I don't know those things, and I can never predict it with any certainty. What I did, though, was approach every family as though they're the ones who are going to make it. And that gave me the motivation to do everything I could to help them get back to that place where their children would be reunified. That was another guiding principle for me. I had to treat everyone as though they're the family that's going to make it. Not always easy. So and almost had to agree, it didn't matter what I felt about somebody. My feelings about that person had to be set aside. I may have certain feelings about addiction. I may have certain feelings about people who harm children. I may have all of these various emotions and thoughts about that. But being able to push that aside, to see that person as somebody who could have their children returned to them, was the work I wanted to focus on. So that helped me. So it's the same. So but in that moment, when we're staying calm and we don't respond in kind to the comments, the insults and the other things that are happening, then we're able to remain in a place where we can use more reasonable, rational responses to those kinds of insults and aggression. And so I think that goes right along with what we all know about our own brain response under stress, that when we respond from a place of stress, we're generally not going to say or do the things that are going to be useful. And so by figuring a way to stay calm in those scenarios and accessing the regions of the brain responsible for problem solving and rational thought, that allows us then to use the empathy and to validate emotions that they're expressing in a way that's much more useful. But we also have to know that there are circumstances, and I'm a huge advocate for saying there is no caseworker or foster parent that needs to place themselves in any sort of a risky situation. And so knowing that despite your best efforts, there's aggression and it's starting to escalate, know when to disengage. And it's okay to say things like, it looks like this isn't going to be a good time for us to resolve this. I would like to call you back later today and maybe we can finish this discussion. So that's the initial phases of maybe disengaging. But obviously, if it ever escalates to a point where you feel safe, just get out. And so we still have to accept that just because we're making every effort to try to help them through empathy, through validation, and all the skills that we are aware of, we still have to know when to keep ourselves safe. So let's don't forget that part of it as well. Okay. So again, I don't know why I put this. Well, no, I know why I put it in because it does cite some of the research from the Children's Bureau about how important visits are and how important that connection to their families are and why that's critical for long-term outcomes. And I'm not going to read it to you. It's there on the screen, but I want you to remember a couple of things that if every arrow points to the need to keep them engaged with their families, and sometimes the very people who sometimes can be abusive and aggressive and insulting and so on, and how are we going to rectify those two things to make it work better? Because as all of you know, after a day of working with people who are potentially exhausting emotionally, that can start to take its toll on us. And so we have to figure out a way, a better way to work with our families and in a way that's going to be much more useful. So first of all, we start from a place where our families are vulnerable, they're worried, they're, as somebody had mentioned, they're in a state of fear, and fear dictates so many of their behaviors. That they're, again, don't confuse, and this was a good point that was made yesterday, don't confuse emotions with behaviors or thoughts. And that means their underlying emotion could be anger, could be fear, frustration, irritation, but the behaviors that are being expressed certainly then can result in those stressors that make it difficult for them to cope with what's happening in their world. And if we're talking about low functioning, at least from a cognitive perspective, low functioning individuals, and that's not disparaging, that is something that we have to accept and agree. Our families, our birth parents are having children placed in foster care because of a condition that they find themselves in, whether that's substance abuse, and we know that renders people less cognitively capable. We know that certain mental illnesses will also do the same thing. And there certainly are other conditions that render people less capable of having the cognitive function to work through and deal with so many of the things that they're struggling with. So they are trying to cope the best they can with a painful situation. The unfortunate outcome for so many, and we know this, is what's their go-to strategy, right? What do they do to cope? Well, I talked about it yesterday. I might jump on a mountain bike and kind of blow some steam off, right? And everybody around me says, that's healthy. Boy, Les, that's a healthy way to cope. Good for you. You found a great coping mechanism. And yet, when we're talking about those that have impairment due to addiction and other conditions, they're not thinking about, the next mountain bike trip. They're thinking about, how do I make this pain go away right now? So these stressors are overwhelming them to the point they go right back to the same coping mechanisms they've always used, and that is the substances for the most part. and we know the outcomes. We don't have to go over all of the outcomes from those circumstances. And so how do we then start to build with individuals who are struggling in those ways, that foundation of trust? And I know that we've been talking a lot about connections, and certainly the title of my remarks today is building connections with our birth parents. So and we may look at that and think, well, what does that have to do with working with a birth parent in a more useful way? Unless they can feel connected in some meaningful way, they may always enter the relationship in a place of resistance. And we know from experience that that is not usually going to end up well, or as well as it potentially could or should have in the process of working with our families. So that's my perspective. How do we build that foundation of trust? And so there you look at all the words using empathy, compassion, validation, and they have so many struggles. And if you could recognize that those struggles are real, that they're not imagined, and start to build a relationship of trust, as my example earlier provided, I think that we start to do better work. Now, I would have to stop here and say, this may sound like it's coming from a caseworker perspective, that, oh, I'm the caseworker, I'm out in the field, I'm knocking on doors, I'm talking to birth parents all the time, so I have to learn these skills. That and yes, absolutely, all caseworkers should have that ability to build a foundation of trust. But I think what gets forgotten is that our caregivers, our foster families, sometimes are not as at least it's not as emphasized that perhaps this is the same skill set that is required of our foster families. And in saying that, all that simply means is, why is it that we can't help our foster parents do the same thing? And the question is, we can. Foster parents can exhibit the same characteristics and abilities to develop empathy, compassion, and validate the struggles of our birth. You can do that. Yet you're in a unique position because you are often viewed differently than even a caseworker, because the children are physically in your home, and often you are seen as the person that is somehow the barrier for reunification. Unfortunate. And so my hope is that in talking about these characteristics, that we can also emphasize to our families that these qualities are and skills, if you will, are the things that must be exhibited by you as well. And I know you do. It's not as though I'm saying that you can't or don't do these things. I know you probably do them ad nauseum, but we have to emphasize that foundation of trust is not just entrusted to the caseworkers, the agency personnel. It is the system. The people that surround the birth parent must all exhibit these same characteristics. And so I want to emphasize that. And so one of the things I started to do as an early foster care caseworker is engage my families in a way that would begin to foster relationships of trust from the very beginning, my foster families. And so one of the things I encouraged, and I found this to be so helpful early, was after the initial placement, after 2 or 3 days, I would meet with the foster family or call them and suggest, hey, would it be okay if you wrote a letter to the birth parents and just told them that their kids were doing well, that they think about you all the time, and that hopefully in the future during visits, we have the opportunity to maybe share some memories about your children, or something nice, something that says, look, I'm not here to keep you from your children. I'm not here to deny you of that relationship. I'm actually trying to promote that relationship. And so here's a note, your kids are doing well. I just want you to know they're thinking about you all the time. The caseworker can certainly deliver that initially. And then these kind of see how that's going to foster a relationship of trust. And what I found for the most part, that started to have an impact, that many of the families that I was working with were actually developing some really cool relationships with our birth parents. And I found, and this is just a sidebar, but as a caseworker, when those relationships between birth parents and foster parents were working, uh, my job was actually kind of easier, right? It actually lessened the burden, if you will, of some of the things I had to worry about. And so I kept doing that. I kept encouraging relationships. Now, I'm not here to say it happened, as a miracle in every circumstances. I'm saying it was helpful, and it did foster a lot of trust, initial trust in that relationship. So I think that's something we ought to consider. All right. So, and this is going to freak some of you out, I think, because I'm going to go back all the way back to the child welfare policy stuff. And so some of you, and maybe there's enough caseworkers, I better ask the question, do they still do the practice model training? Is that still a thing? Yeah, I've lost track. Is that still something that's happening out there for new caseworkers? Okay, I don't know. I can do this. I can go back, I can look at the chat, and no one has responded. Anybody can confirm that the practice model training is still happening out there? Yes. Okay, a lot of it. So I got a response. So thank you. I and so some of you are familiar with that, and I'm hoping all of you are. But I don't know that many of our families or our foster families necessarily are. But certainly we go back to those initial conversations about, okay, we need to have relationships. It was emphasized as part of our training, initial immersion into becoming a caseworker. What are the core conditions of relationships? And so I approach this as not reinventing the wheel, but going back to the foundation of what it means to actually be able to build a relationship. And so first of all, the obvious responses are the respect, the genuineness, the empathy, things I've already alluded to as part of my remarks. So having said those things, do we simply go to training? And I look at this and think, I used to do the practice model training back in the day, and I often walked away. Are people seriously looking at this as a way to help them improve their casework practices, or is this another requirement to be able to do their job? And I worried about that sometimes. Yet many of the participants exhibited the qualities they have in training and in the role plays and different things that were happening. I said, well, most, if not all of you, have the qualities of understanding and building relationships. And I worried that was that being translated to the practice out in the field. And so that's what I was hoping to see, that we go back to recognizing that practice model training is not an arbitrary requirement to becoming a caseworker. It is a real opportunity to examine and evaluate how we can develop relationships. And so if we become good at listening, and you heard all the variations of listening, whether it's the nonverbal communication, the active listening, to be able to reflect back to people some of the things that they're saying. But in the end, by being a good listener, it's helping people focus on what needs to be heard, and not just simply hearing the words, but hearing what's underneath those words. And certainly, again, that helps us recognize the underlying emotion. What we all know, it's the underlying emotion that's typically driving the behaviors that are resulting. And so that then leads to giving us a deeper understanding of the person's circumstances. And so while I can try to empathize as much as I can, I certainly don't know what it's like to have a lifelong of addiction. I don't know what that is like to go through some of those circumstances of trauma that other people have described. I don't. I don't know what it's like to survive a domestic violence assault. I don't. But I can certainly listen to somebody and gain a deeper understanding of those circumstances. And based on what they're describing, then be able to reflect that back to them in an empathetic way. And that's really where the skill comes in handy. So, having said all of that, we first want to address, and as Liz had mentioned at the beginning, one of the primary focuses of our clinical program, at least the initiation of that, was to focus on what happens to our foster families when a child goes home or they're reunified. What are they going through? And we have to remember that the grief of losing a child, even to reunification, is a real process of grieving the loss of a child. And in many circumstances, we look at how people experience loss. Well, one, we know that we lose loved ones to death. We sometimes go through divorce. We go through a number of life circumstances where a person in our life is no longer there. And so we know what that's like to lose a child. And so we have to turn that back and say, how can I use that information to help a birth family who's struggling? And so in the face of the resistance, in the face of the accusations and all of the things that they may be describing to me, I can still look at them. Despite all the things that are going on that may not always feel good to me, I can look at them and say, can't imagine what it's like for you not to have your child, and to begin to normalize those grief responses for them, and even to grieve with the parent and talk about and reflect on your own grief experiences. And, again, you don't have to share your personal experiences, but you can certainly share the feelings you felt during those periods to help them gain a sense of how to get through this very difficult thing. And often, and this is why I love this approach. I mean, we're here to talk about how to make, or not make, we can never make somebody change, how we can approach these resistant and aggressive or families that are just not cooperative. How do we change our approach? Well, certainly by trying to relate their experiences to their valid emotions, and some of the responses is going to go a long way to reducing the resistance and likely increase some sense of trust in the process. And that's what we hope for, because it's all of the things not all, certainly many of the things that they're experiencing is mistrust of the system, including the caseworkers, including the foster parents. And the more we can break down those barriers, the more likely then we see a parent responding to the process in a much more reasonable way. And again, I don't know if everyone's going to do it. And I know that every birth parent doesn't respond in the ways I'm hoping. But again, I have to give that parent every effort to demonstrate that ability, because they're the ones that are going to make it. In my mind, they are the ones that are going to succeed. And that's what I want to pay attention to. And excuse me, as we go through this process of helping them understand their own grief of losing their children, please keep in mind what helped you. We addressed this at our retreat yesterday, which is when we're hurting, when we're in pain, when we're struggling and suffering, what has helped us the most? And we agreed that it was the ability to rely on supports or relationships. That was the one thing that I always have. I keep using these absolutes, but do I always do that? Probably not. But I certainly try to illustrate that one of the things that get us through these circumstances is other people. I mean, there's nothing I can say to a birth parent that takes that pain away. There's nothing that makes that less intense. You all know from personal experience that you have been through these immense pains yourselves. And the one thing that feels like it helps me the most, and I'm sure it's true for many of you, is ability to turn to somebody and just simply be able to talk about what I'm experiencing. So that's very, very important. Okay, so but the other thing I forgot to mention as part of that is as we know that they're going through that loss of their role as a parent, please keep in mind that one of the best outcomes is to actually increase the role of the parent. And by the way, that shouldn't always mean increase the visits, increase the times of the visits. It simply means that there are so many things the child has to do as part of them being in your home. They have visits, of course, they have doctor visits, they have parent teacher conferences, they have other things. Maybe they're in a soccer, you signed them up for a soccer team. So why can't we, and again, through approval of caseworkers and others, why can't we then increase the role in those routines that you are involved in and involve the parent as well? And that does require a relationship. I have to be able to have that contact with the birth parent to be able to say, hey, Johnny has a soccer game tonight. He would really, or we would really like you to be there. And if they say I need a ride, certainly I know that's out of the ordinary, but is there a way to get them there in a way that's going to work for all of you? You're running the child around, maybe you're not available, but certainly somebody else might be available to help with those circumstances. So involve the parent and try to increase that role so that they again, it mitigates some of the emotional responses to feeling like they've lost their children. Okay. And then, there's certainly the jealousy issues, which I think is something that we all encounter, right? They want, and the best example is when the birth parent hears their children call the foster parent mom. How many of you have experienced that, kind of that conflict? I'm going to escape and look at some of your comments in the chat. Anybody have that experience where, yeah, so I'm hearing a yes and a lot. Boy, look at they're popping up. Amy Smith, and Amy Bates, the two Amy's, I guess we're calling them. Oh, I've got about 5 minutes left. I just got a warning. Oh boy. See, this is the problem. There's so much information. There's just so much out there that we need to talk about. So to certainly address this issue, we do have to encourage that relationship with the parent and promote with the child the idea that their mother is their mother, that you, and maybe mom is simply a title, but they're always point in the direction of the birth parent as their mother. And when you refer to her or him, as in the case of birth father, that you don't call them by their names, you talk to them in the context of father and mother. And then certainly we know that part of that competition that comes from the jealousy is now I'm gonna outdo the foster parent, right? And all of a sudden they're showering them with gifts, they're bringing excess amounts of treats and so forth. And one of the things that I've often used to try to mitigate that is the family team meeting. I've had some foster parents themselves who have essentially contacted the birth parent and had a conversation about some of the boundaries because of what it does and for children, particularly if it's around meal times, and how that's not helpful, and that, but appreciating that they really want to be connected to their children in a meaningful way. But how can we alter that? And would it be okay if I was able to take those treats to my house so that they had them over between the visits, so that that's something that kind of reminds them of you, so to speak. So I've had foster parents talk about that directly with birth parents. I've resolved some of that in family team meetings. Okay. So I'm getting a lot of responses here. So I just want to look and read some of the comments, because it looks like, man, we're out of time. So it hurts. Yeah. So calling a parent or having the birth parent hear the children call you mom, again, the comment is, yes, it hurts the parent. And also, if they would think of it as just a word, something, someone is taking care of him at the time. And I think that's true. One of the I guess, things I've always believed about the title parent is it is a title. It's not something you're just gifted because you had a child. And so if you are a parent, if you're a father, are you doing the job of a father? And if you are a mother, are you doing the job of mom? And so I think that's part of it. We have to recognize that. I think the child is simply seeing me do the mothering role at this point. But I want that birth parent to know you are their mother, and I never want to take that away from you, or I don't want to take that away from you. So those are some of the things that you can have those conversations about. But it does certainly rely on that foundation of trust to be able to do that. I had one kid that called every woman mom, so it didn't really mean anything, and I've seen that too. So as we learned from Elisa earlier, one of the outcomes of the attachment struggles that many of our kids have is that they're so eager to be in a relationship with a parent that title is used for anybody that may show them at least a small modicum of attention. And yeah, so we have to recognize that mom isn't always something that they're using as a way to describe their connection, as much as it is their lack of attachment and ability to make those connections in a meaningful way. So yeah, so good point. I am now looking like I'm out of time. Marshall, it looks like we're done, right? Okay.
We could listen to you forever, Les, because you
Well,
have such great wisdom.
I'm gonna. That's nice of you to say, and I appreciate that, and I appreciate. Now that I'm looking at the chat, I'm noticing, God, there's been so many comments I wished I could respond to. So I've got some material. I have the slides. I'm going to invite anybody who's here today to email me directly with specific questions related to how do I take care of a problem I'm experiencing with the birth parent. And part of my role as the clinical specialist for Utah Foster Care is to be able to address those issues with our families in a way that you can feel supported and that you can get some resolution in some of these issues. So I invite all of you to contact me directly, and I can share not only personal experiences, but some of the other research and things that go along with how we're going to improve these relationships so that they don't become a big problem for us. So looks like I'm out of time. So, wow. Thanks everybody for indulging me in this process. I appreciate it. I hope that in the end that all of you walk away with at least a basic understanding of I still, after all these years, and I mentioned it at the facilitator retreat yesterday, 34 years, October 1, after all of these years, I still have the same passion for this work. I love what I do. I love helping you do better at what you do. And I want to continue this work in a meaningful way for all of us. So please use the resources. I'm a resource for all of you. Please reach out and we'll make sure that you get what you need. So thank you very much.